Our third and final speaker is Caroline Hughes. She's the Director of the Asia Research Centre and Associate Professor of Governance Studies in the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Murdoch University. She is a graduate of Oxford and Hull universities in the United Kingdom. For her PhD and subsequently, Caroline has researched how international aid, politics and policy prescriptions on human rights, democracy promotion and good governance have affected Indigenous processes of state building and the construction of state-society relations. Her extensive fieldwork to date has been based in Cambodia and Timor-Leste. Please welcome Caroline.
Thanks very much, Jane, and thanks to everybody for coming along to listen to us. I have got a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll see if I can start that. Right, okay. So I think I want to start off, not to be outdone, I'm going to tell you a brief anecdote of my own for one experience that I had when I was in Timor-Leste doing fieldwork in 2005. So that was 3 years after independence was restored, but a year before the violence in Dili in 2006, which has already been mentioned and led to the return of Australian soldiers to Timor. And I'm going to tell you this story because I think it illustrates well the key point that I want to make in this presentation, which is the importance of local politics in post-conflict reconstruction. I think that aid agencies like AusAid and other aid agencies around the world, and the taxpayers that fund those aid agencies, people like you and I, have been too inclined to think of politics as something dangerous and destabilising, or as rather a self-indulgence compared to the necessity of doing things like building roads or reconstructing schools and feeding people in post-conflict situations. But the point that I want to make today is that politics, and paying attention to the way politics is organised and the way that state-society relations take place in post-conflict countries, is fundamental to all those kind of practical reconstruction tasks. So in 2005, word got out in Timor-Leste that the Timorese government of the time was discussing with foreign experts the question of making religious education, and particularly catechism, an optional part of the school curriculum, whereas it had previously been compulsory. Now, the Catholic Church in Timor-Leste was not very pleased about this, and in fact they organised a demonstration to protest this move. Now, I don't really want to go into the ins and outs of the policy or of the church's position, but I think what was interesting to me about that demonstration was the way that it was organised. Now, the church sent out messages to various parts of the country and called young people to get involved in these demonstrations. Trucks and buses were chartered to bring those people in their hundreds to the capital city, and they demonstrated during the day in the main square, and at night they all sort of went off and were billeted around various churches and churchyards in Dili. The church organised food for the demonstrators, most of whom were poor people who clearly didn't have the money to support themselves in the capital city, and it gave out T-shirts with messages on so you could tell who was in town for the demonstrations because they were wearing their T-shirts. And it organised various sort of speeches and things during the day for the crowds of protesters. And these protests continued in Dili for 3 weeks. So the atmosphere around Dili at the time was quite tense, and if you went into the back streets, you could see sort of busloads of police waiting with tear gas canisters to intervene in case a confrontation began. And because my research was about Timorese politics, I went to the demonstration site with my Timorese research assistant to see what was happening and to see what kinds of things people in the crowds were talking about. And arriving at the scene for the first time, I could hear that somebody was singing into a microphone in the centre of the protest here, and there were hundreds of people gathered around in dense crowds listening. And I wanted to find out what's going on. Is there some sort of event here? And so I pushed my way into the crowds to see what they were singing. Was it going to be some sort of nationalist anthem or militant Christian hymns or something like this? But I was very surprised when I got close enough to find that the microphone was actually attached to a karaoke machine, and a young man holding it was singing Lionel Richie's Stuck on You, and singing it very nicely. And everyone was enjoying it immensely. And at that moment, I sort of conceived a very strong intuition that these protests were going to remain peaceful, because I think, with all due respect to Lionel, his songs are never going to furnish the soundtrack to a riot. And this turned out to be the case. After 3 weeks of this standoff, the church and the government eventually came to an accommodation on the issue, and the church, having demonstrated its power, packed these demonstrators off home, with almost no public order incidents having taken place at all. And in a country where getting the most basic services restored and the simplest projects off the ground was held by foreign experts to be an incredibly difficult uphill struggle, the church had apparently quite effortlessly mobilised hundreds of young people around a particular goal, sustained their interest and enthusiasm, kept the lid on any antisocial tendencies, while making a rather spectacular political point. So I think this is quite significant, I think, in two ways. First of all, because it indicated the very impressive ability of the Catholic Church in East Timor to get things done. And this contrasted sharply with the situation a year later, in 2006, when further demonstrations occurred as a result of the breakdown of order and discipline in another important national institution, the armed forces, and rioting, looting and burning in the capital city quickly ensued. And I think it is relatively easy in a lot of poor or post-conflict countries to rouse, a rabble of looters. And these are pictures that we have regularly seen on TV in Australia of East Timor. It's much less easy, I think, to sustain a committed and disciplined and peaceful demonstration of Lionel Richie fans. The impressive organisational power of the church in this case was not lost on Timor's current president, José Ramos Horta. Ramos Horta has long described himself as an independent in East Timorese politics and has been quite shy of political party connections. But when he stood for election to the presidency the following year, in 2007 he stood with church backing and was elected over his Fretilin opponent. So he clearly understood the lesson that the church was giving to the government in 2005. More generally, I think this incident, the demonstrations that the church conducted, indicates the importance of organisation in post-conflict politics. The ability to organise followers, spread ideas, influence opinion, mobilise strength of numbers is fundamental to the ability not just to sort of prevail over opponents in elections or in policy disputes, but to get things done in terms of implementation as well. And in the early years of Timor's independence, there were few political parties who could match the church's level of organisation, given its network of personnel and buildings, its access to resources. It had regular schedules of services and meetings and so on. The first post-2002 government of East Timor had lots of very clever people in it and plenty of very clever external advisors, including a lot of very clever Australian experts. But its connections to the villages of East Timor were extremely weak, and this, I would argue, was the cause of that government's final downfall, the resignation of the Prime Minister in 2006 and its electoral defeat in 2007. So I think this has lessons for us in terms of thinking about what international aid should seek to do in post-conflict countries.